Mr. President, Ilhan Omar said, putting extra weight on the title like she was testing how flimsy it sounded. And I'm using that term very loosely. She stayed standing in front of the resolute desk with her arms folded, refusing the chair as if sitting would mean surrendering the room. Her voice had that practiced edge, half moral indictment, half camera-ready swagger, like she could already hear the clips being cut for the evening shows. She talked like this was just another skirmish where the other side eventually blinked, and she didn't plan to blink. And Donald Trump, in this telling, didn't do her the favor of reacting the way she'd rehearsed for. He didn't bark back, didn't play the loud, messy foil she expected, didn't give her the easy win of a tantrum. He sat behind the desk with a small, almost bored smile, like he was watching a rerun he'd already seen. The Oval Office was bright with winter daylight, the kind that makes everything look sharper and colder at the same time. There were no aides crowding the corners, no note-takers tapping away, no photographers negotiating angles. Just Trump, two agents by the doors, and a tight little cluster of officials standing off to the side with folders that looked too thick to be ceremonial. Omar kept going anyway, because momentum is its own drug. She framed the meeting as a petty power play, painted him as a man surrounded by rich friends and resort town loyalists, and treated his authority like a prop she could knock off the table. She tossed out his legal troubles as if the numbers alone were supposed to end the argument, and she brought up the stain of January 6th, the way people bring up a prior conviction in a closing statement. If this was about Gaza, she implied, he could spare her the pretend outrage, because she wasn't auditioning for his approval. She leaned in, not physically touching the desk, but close enough to make the point. She was here to dominate, not to negotiate. Then she pivoted to the classic list: immigration, Muslims, cages, fascist, as a blunt instrument, and delivered it like a speech she'd practiced in the car. She reminded him she had a national platform, a loyal audience, and friendly outlets ready to frame her as the brave truth-teller versus the bully. She said he was old, weak, and acting tough because it was the only language he understood. She declared she wasn't afraid of him, and for a moment she seemed to believe that saying it out loud would make it true. And still, he watched her with that same calm, as if the volume didn't reach him. When he interrupted, it wasn't with anger so much as finality. "Sit down," he said, not loud, not theatrical, just flat and controlled. Omar paused mid-sentence because the tone didn't match the script she had in her head. She expected a shouting match. Instead, she got the voice of someone who thought he already had the end of the story. He repeated it, "Sit down," and added, almost casually, that what she was about to hear would land better if she wasn't on her feet. She sat slowly, as if lowering herself might keep her from falling. The smile on his face faded, and the room's temperature seemed to drop with it. He told her, in plain language, that she'd misread why she was there. If this was a story about tweets and cable hits and overseas talking points, he suggested, he wouldn't have bothered. Then he slid a folder across the desk and said the reason she'd been summoned was national security, and the paperwork, according to him, had been sitting in the government's hands for months. He framed it as an investigation, not a verdict, which is the kind of wording people choose when they want to sound clinical while still letting fear do the heavy lifting. He said the file involved allegations about improper overseas transfers and serious questions about immigration paperwork from years earlier. He talked about financing networks and structured transactions and designations, the bureaucratic language that always sounds more credible because it's so boring. He claimed the evidence had been declassified, not all of it, just enough to make headlines and make allies scatter. And he presented it as a choice: leave quietly and control the narrative, or fight publicly and watch the narrative control you. At that moment, Omar's confidence didn't evaporate in one dramatic gasp. It thinned, the way a strong scent fades when you realize the window is open. She looked at the folder like it might bite her, then looked back at Trump as if to measure whether he was bluffing. She started to protest. Constitutional this, separation of powers that, but he cut through it by calling on the people standing to the side. In this version of events, FBI Director Christopher Wray stepped forward with the posture of someone who believes the paperwork speaks for itself. And in this version, Kristi Noem stood ready with immigration files like a prosecutor who'd been counting down the days. Wray, as the story goes, began with money. He laid out transfer records and claimed there was a pattern. Amounts kept below reporting thresholds, timing that looked deliberate, destinations that raised eyebrows. He emphasized that sending money overseas isn't inherently illegal, which is exactly the kind of sentence you say right before you explain why this particular case is different. He said investigators traced transfers to a relative in Mogadishu, and that the relative's business had, at some point, drawn the attention of sanctions authorities. He presented a chain of claims, wire to a middleman, middleman to a network, network to people who show up on lists, and implied the chain mattered more than intent. Omar, in this telling, tried to insist it was family support and nothing more. Wray's response in the narrative was to point at her committee role and suggest she should have known how informal transfer systems can be exploited. That phrase, should have known, is a knife because it lets you accuse without proving state of mind. He referenced watch lists and designations and intelligence that he couldn't fully lay out in the room, and he implied there were intercepts tying the money trail to names the public would recognize as dangerous if the names were ever released. He didn't say, "You are guilty," but he stacked the pieces so the listener could do the concluding for him. Then, Noem, according to the script you provided, pivoted to identity and immigration history. She treated the Congresswoman's personal origin story like a case file, not a biography, and suggested parts of it didn't match government records. In this account, she claimed there were discrepancies around family names used in refugee processing, and she argued that those discrepancies weren't innocent paperwork errors. She introduced the most emotionally charged allegation by framing it around a mother, alive, documented abroad, allegedly described differently in public remarks. And she used the kind of rhetorical move that lands with audiences. Not prove you're lying, but explain why the documents say what they say. The story then layers in marriage records, timing, and insinuation, which is how political scandals are built even before they're proven. It suggests a past relationship was used for immigration advantage, then unwound when the advantage was secured. A pattern that sounds damning even when the evidence is murky. It tosses in a challenge. DNA. Verification, the courtroom trope of, if you're innocent, you'd agree. Because challenges are persuasive, even when they're not legally meaningful. Noem, in the narrative, doesn't present it as settled fact. She presents it as a basis for a process, which is different but still terrifying. And the room, as described, becomes less a meeting and more a staged moment, where each official has a role and each role points in one direction. Then the story introduces the NSA angle, because nothing raises stakes faster than audio clips and classified markings. General Sarah Mitchell, in the text you provided, appears as the voice of "we listened" and "we have recordings," the modern version of "we saw your letters." In this telling, she alleges calls with foreign officials and frames them as coordination, rather than routine diplomacy. She brings up language, we versus they, and treats pronouns like proof of divided loyalty, which is the kind of thing that plays well on television even when it's not dispositive in court. And she adds one more ingredient that always makes viewers sit up: the idea that sensitive briefings might have been discussed outside approved channels. Now, if you're telling this as an American political narrator, you don't have to say any of it is true to explain why it would shake a city built on perception. You just have to show how the accusation itself becomes gravity. In Washington, a legendo still ruins careers because donors don't wait for verdicts and leaders don't defend people who make them look reckless. So in the Oval Office scene, Trump doesn't need to convict Omar. He just needs to make her isolation inevitable. That's the whole strategy implied by the way the story is structured. The paperwork is the weapon, but the timing is the trigger. Trump, in your narrative, returns to the microphone without ever touching one. He takes the mountain of allegations and boils it down into a simple ultimatum: resign, leave, disappear, or get dragged through a public process that will eat you alive. He offers a quiet exit to exit as if it's mercy, while making it clear the quiet exit is also control. He lets her choose the packaging, not the outcome, which is exactly how powerful people sell coercion as choice. And he does it with the tone of a man who believes his leverage is so complete he can afford to sound polite. Omar, as written, protests with constitutional language, which is what you say when you're trying to anchor yourself to something bigger than the room you're in. But constitutional arguments don't stop headlines, and headlines don't pause for legal nuance. The story has her looking down at records, photos, transcripts, whether real or not, in the world outside the page, and realizing she can't out-slogan paper. That's the dramatic turn. Earlier, she weaponizes words. Now, words stop working. And the irony, laid on thick, is that she came expecting to create a viral moment, and instead becomes the subject of one. Then the narrative rewinds, because every good political thriller wants you to see how arrogance becomes vulnerability. We go back to her congressional office hours earlier, where staffers treat the summons as either a trap or an opportunity. She reads it as theater, because she's lived in theater. Cameras, confrontations, fundraising spikes that follow conflict like clockwork. Her communications team becomes the chorus, half worried and half excited, lining up friendly coverage the way modern politics lines up oxygen. And she laughs off the risk because, in her mind, the worst-case scenario is a shouting match that makes her look brave. In parallel, the story cuts to the Situation Room, where the tone is pure bureaucracy and the stakes are presented as cold. This is where Trump, as portrayed, becomes less carnival barker and more executive chairman reviewing an acquisition. Except the asset is a career. Ray lays out flowcharts. Noam lays out immigration files. Lawyers lay out process. And the whole thing is framed as methodical. The plot point is that the decision is already made before Omar even arrives. The meeting is just the reveal, and the political calculation is made explicit. The quiet route avoids accusations of targeting. The loud route overwhelms defenses with documentation. If you're narrating this, you can add the dark humor that Washington deserves, because the funniest part of almost every scandal isn't the scandal. It's the belief that the scandal will follow the rules of your own imagination. Omar imagines Trump as reactive. Trump imagines Omar as predictable. The staff imagines the media as loyal. The media imagines the audience as simple. Everyone, in other words, is playing chess against a board that keeps changing shape. That's why, even as fiction, it feels plausible. The human mistakes are real, even if the details are not. Then the story returns to the West Wing hallway at 2:30 p.m., where reporters wait outside like fishermen who smell blood in the water. Omar walks in tall, committed to the performance, convinced she can handle a man she's handled before, at least in public. The door opens, and the set doesn't look like the set she expected, and you can almost see the first crack form. But she doesn't retreat, because public fighters rarely know how to retreat privately. Retreat feels like betrayal of the brand. So she charges forward, and the room lets her. And that's the trap, letting someone talk until they can't remember where they started. From there, the narrative becomes a countdown. 72 hours, noon Friday, a deadline that turns advice into panic. She consults lawyers who don't do television hits, the kind who speak in probabilities and worst-case scenarios, and tell you what it costs to be stubborn. The lawyers in the story don't even need the full file. They just need the outline to understand how ugly the optics would get. And that's key. The legal truth matters, but the political truth is that she can't survive the accusation long enough to win the case. So she sits with a resignation letter and stares at it, because signing it would mean admitting the other side controlled the story. Then comes the phone call, and the tone shifts from "you have time" to "your time is over." Ray calls, allegedly, and asks for an answer like a bill collector with a badge. She asks for more time because people always ask for more time when time is the only thing they don't have. He says no, and the line goes quiet. And in that quiet, the narrative lets her decide to fight. Not because it's smart, but because pride is loud. This is the moment the story wants you to judge. Was it courage? Was it denial? Was it miscalculation? Or was it the simple inability to accept humiliation? At 11:45, the announcement drops. Urgent press conference, national security, member of Congress. Catnip for every producer in America. Speculation explodes because speculation is cheaper than reporting and faster than truth. The cameras cut to the Rose Garden, and Trump walks out flanked by the kind of lineup that tells the audience it's not a joke. In your text, he speaks with blunt certainty. In a safer telling, he would couch it as serious allegations supported by ongoing investigations, but the effect is the same. He sets the frame first, because in politics, the first frame is often the only one that sticks. Ray follows with binders and selected exhibits, the way institutions lend legitimacy to a claim by wearing their uniforms while presenting it. Noam follows with the personal history angle, because nothing turns a political story into a human scandal like family and identity. Lawyers follow with process, because process makes it feel inevitable. And the press, watching live, does what the press always does. Asks 10 questions at once and remembers only the most inflammatory phrasing. Meanwhile, Omar's office responds with the only response available in a moment like that. Politically motivated, targeted. This is about who she is, because that's the counterframe. The story then does something cynical but accurate to how America consumes drama. It shows even sympathetic outlets struggling to fully carry her. Not because they've suddenly become neutral saints, but because paper trails, real or alleged, are difficult to dunk on without looking reckless. So, you get careful language from leadership, distancing statements that sound like, if true, it's serious, which is Washington's version of "don't tag me in this." Moderates peel away first because they're always reading the polls, and they know a story doesn't have to be proven to be poisonous. And the squad, in this narrative, goes quieter than usual, which the audience reads as either strategy or panic depending on what they already believe. Next comes the ethics machinery. Committees, emergency reviews, draft resolutions, the procedural gears that make moral outrage look official. The story claims an expulsion vote happens fast, which is dramatic, and it uses the vote count to emphasize abandonment. This is where the narrator can lean in with a little bite. Nothing in Washington moves quickly until it's about saving Washington. When power feels threatened, the institution becomes a sprinter. When ordinary people need something, the institution becomes a historian. Then the narrative stretches into the long fight. Civil proceedings, motions, dismissals denied. The slow grind of law that makes people forget the details but remember the headline. It describes a judge focusing on evidence rather than motive, which is a line that sounds noble even as politics simmers underneath. It describes months turning into a year, appeals, denials, the sense that the system is rolling forward regardless of speeches. Omar becomes, in the story, less a lawmaker and more a defendant-shaped silhouette, a person whose identity is rewritten by filing numbers. And the narrator can remind the audience that this is what power does. It reduces human beings to case captions and then argues about the caption. Eventually, in your text, the hammer falls. Citizenship revoked. Detention, deportation, cameras capturing the walk. To keep it within the boundaries you asked for, it's smarter to frame that ending as the story's claimed outcome. In this account, the record as presented, the sequence described, rather than a declaration that it happened. Because the real point isn't whether every detail is literal truth. The point is what the story is trying to teach its audience about leverage and hubris. The moral is that celebrity doesn't immunize you from paperwork, and outrage doesn't erase a document once the document is on a podium. And the darker moral is that the threat of exposure can be used like a tool, even when the exposure is partial, selective, or designed for maximum damage. The final stretch of your narrative turns Omar into a cautionary tale told at rallies, a talking point packaged as easy way or hard way. Trump, as portrayed, sells it as proof that nobody is untouchable. And the crowd cheers because crowds love a simplified ending. Policy shifts are described as if they flowed neatly from the scandal, because stories like to pretend history moves in straight lines. And the narrator closes the loop by bringing the audience back to that first moment in the Oval Office. Omar standing, confident, convinced the room belonged to her. In the end, the room belonged to whoever controlled the files, the timing, and the camera. And that's the part that should make viewers uneasy, no matter which team they root for. The part people missed in the first 24 hours wasn't the binder or the podium lineup. It was the speed at which everyone started speaking in the language of inevitability. Cable panels weren't asking, "What's true?" so much as, "How long can she survive?" which tells you what our politics has become. In Washington, the question is never just whether an allegation holds up. It's whether the allegation can be survived long enough to get to the holding up part. And if you've ever wondered why so many public figures look like they're reading off invisible cue cards, it's because the real script is written by fear of the next headline. Once national security gets stamped on a story, nuance becomes contraband. In this telling, Omar's first instinct was to go back to what had always worked. Seize the frame, make it about motive, make it about who benefits, make it about the messenger. She didn't deny every line item so much as reject the premise, implying the entire thing was designed to punish dissent and scare anyone who spoke too loudly on foreign policy. That's not an irrational move in America, because history gives you examples where power has used investigations as theater and theater as discipline. But the problem with arguing motive is that motive is cheap and portable, while documents, real, alleged, or selectively presented, feel heavy. Viewers don't know how to evaluate probable cause, but they know what a highlighted wire transfer looks like, and they trust highlighters more than they should. Her allies had to decide fast what kind of defense they were actually signing up for. Defending someone's right to speak is one thing. Defending someone's paperwork is another, because paperwork is where hero narratives go to die. Even sympathetic lawmakers began to hedge, not because they suddenly hated her, but because they could already hear attack ads stitching their faces next to phrases like watch list and declassification. And the brutal truth is that American political friendship often ends at the border of the next election cycle. You can hear the knives being put away in real time when people say, "We should let the process play out," with the tone of someone already walking toward the exit. Back in Minnesota, the local story split into two wars happening at once. On one side were supporters who saw a familiar pattern. A Muslim woman who built a career challenging power now facing the full weight of that power. On the other side were critics who saw a different pattern. A politician they already disliked now wrapped in allegations that confirmed everything they'd assumed for years. The district turned into a mirror for the whole country, less about the facts on the table and more about the facts people were already carrying in their heads. And in between those two camps were voters who don't live on Twitter, trying to figure out why every answer sounded like an ad. The legal fight, as framed by the narrative you're building, becomes its own kind of slow-burn spectacle. You've got civil standards versus criminal standards, preponderance versus beyond a reasonable doubt, and a public that hears civil and assumes it means easy. You've got accusations that lean on foreign records, which sets off the predictable argument. How much do you trust documents from places where record-keeping can be messy? You've got lawyers on television acting like federal court is a football field, calling plays with certainty while never having to sign their names to the filings. And you've got a simple question that keeps haunting the whole thing. If the evidence is so overwhelming, why does it need to be sold like a reality show? Trump's team, in the story, understands something about American attention that most politicians pretend not to know. People don't follow procedure. They follow emotion. And emotion follows conflict. And conflict follows deadlines. That's why the 72 hours detail lands so hard, because it turns a complicated set of accusations into a ticking clock anyone can understand. It also turns the subject into a character trapped in a game they didn't choose, which is great for ratings and terrible for justice. And yes, it's possible for a case to be serious and still be staged for maximum spectacle. Those things aren't mutually exclusive in modern politics. Omar's media appearances, in this continuation, become less about arguing facts and more about resisting humiliation. She's no longer the one delivering the punchline. She's the one explaining why the punchline shouldn't count. Every time she says, politically motivated, she's trying to move the conversation away from the paper trail and back to the power trail. But audiences are fickle, and they don't reward complexity when there's a simpler emotion available, like outrage or betrayal or "I knew it." So the question becomes, how do you sell innocence in a culture that treats doubt like weakness and certainty like strength? Behind the scenes, the Democratic leadership's posture looks less like strategy and more like triage. They're not thinking first about Omar. They're thinking about the institution, the majority, the next fight, the next funding deadline, the next map. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them politicians, which is another way of saying they're allergic to taking a risk that doesn't pay off fast. If there's one thing Washington fears more than a scandal, it's being seen as defending the wrong person at the wrong moment. And if the accusations involve national security buzzwords, the fear doubles, because nobody wants to be the headline that says defended and terror in the same sentence, even if the defense is procedural. Meanwhile, Republican media treats the story like a jackpot that keeps paying out. Every segment becomes a victory lap. Every new filing becomes bombshell. Every unnamed source becomes confirmed. And every clip of Omar looking tense becomes proof. It's less journalism than ritual. An audience hearing what it came to hear. A host performing the role the audience paid for. But here's the twist that makes it interesting. The more it's celebrated like a partisan win, the more it invites the question of whether the process is being used as a weapon. And once that question is in the air, it doesn't go away, because it has a shelf life longer than any one scandal. In the story's universe, the court refuses to treat motive as magic. A judge can acknowledge politics without letting politics erase filings, because courts live and die by the idea that evidence is evidence, regardless of who hates whom. That sounds clean on paper, but in the real world, evidence is often a curated subset presented at a strategic moment, and everyone knows it. So the public watches a legal process unfold while also watching a communications war running parallel to it, and the two are constantly bleeding into each other. The question isn't just what's true, but who gets to decide what the public sees and when. If you want the continuation to stay sharp without stepping into direct accusation, lean into the contradictions. Why would a White House choose a midday spectacle if the goal is national security rather than narrative control? Why would a subject refuse a quiet exit if the alternative truly guarantees ruin, unless they believe the case is exaggerated or they believe the public will eventually see through it? Why do some officials speak with absolute certainty while leaning on information they claim they can't fully reveal? And why does the modern public treat classified as both an argument for trust and a reason for suspicion, depending on which side it helps? As the months drag on in this version, Omar's world shrinks into legal meetings, controlled statements, and the brutal loneliness of being treated like a liability. People who once texted encouragement stop texting, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, which is how political circles enforce discipline without ever admitting they're doing it. Her supporters become more intense and more defensive, because when you believe someone is being targeted, every new allegation feels like proof of the targeting. Her critics become more gleeful and more careless, because when you think you're watching a villain fall, you stop caring about due process. And the rest of America does what it always does: half-watches, forgets, then suddenly remembers when there's a new dramatic development. Then comes the institutional fallout, which is where the story can widen from one person to the whole system. Congress starts talking about vetting, disclosures, foreign contact reporting, the kind of reforms everyone loves in theory and hates when they're applied to them. Security briefings become political weapons. Who had access? Who said what? Who can be trusted? Who can be quietly sidelined from sensitive committees? Immigration policy hardliners hold up the case as a morality play, while immigration advocates warn that any case can be used to justify broader crackdowns. And the public, caught in the middle, is left with a question that is both fair and uncomfortable. Can we demand accountability without turning accountability into a tool for settling scores? The Trump rally circuit, in this continuation, never lets the story become just a legal matter. He retells it as personal dominance. She tried to big-time me, she found out. Because that's the brand, and brands don't do modesty. But you can add a layer of irony here without being cruel. The man who complains about witch hunts becomes the man narrating one like it's a triumph. That doesn't prove anything about the case. It proves something about American politics, where consistency is optional and winning is the only principle that survives. And it forces a bigger question. If one administration can apply maximum pressure to a political enemy using the language of national security, what stops the next administration from doing the same thing in reverse? The climax of a story like this Doesn't have to be handcuffs or planes or anything graphic to land hard. The real climax is the moment the public realizes that process can be as punishing as punishment, even before any final judgment. It's the moment donors freeze, committees strip assignments, leadership stops answering calls, and the person at the center becomes a cautionary tale, while still insisting they're innocent. It's the moment the audience is forced to admit they don't actually know what's true, but they still have feelings about it strong enough to ruin lives. And it's the moment you, as narrator, can ask the question that keeps viewers listening. If the system can do this to someone famous, what does it do to people nobody knows? So the next chapter isn't really about Ilhan Omar or Donald Trump as individuals. It's about what their collision reveals about the machine. A machine that runs on optics but hides behind procedure. A machine that demands trust while feeding suspicion. A machine that calls itself principled while acting like a street fight. If Omar is innocent in this story's world, then the machine is terrifying because it can crush a person through insinuation and selective disclosure. If Omar is guilty in this story's world, then the machine is still terrifying because it waited for the perfect political moment to strike rather than acting purely as a neutral guardian. Either way, the viewer is left staring at the same uncomfortable possibility. In American politics, the truth matters, but timing matters more.